pleased to be joined by Lara Shear, who has extensive knowledge of sustainability through her studies on climate change and environmental history, and working for Planet Mark, which is a sustainable certification organization. So Lara, thank you for joining us in the Euro Sustainability module to share your knowledge on some of the terminology that can be confusing to people as they start or actually evolve their sustainability journey. So welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Lara, if we could start, many companies in the global mobility industry, with their journeys, greenwashing comes up a lot, and a lot of people do get concerned that they may be greenwashing or don't really understand what greenwashing is. Could you share with us your thoughts on what greenwashing is?
Yeah, no, of course. So just using kind of a standard definition, greenwashing has been defined as a process of conveying a false impression or providing misleading information about how a company's products or services are more environmentally sound than they actually are. And it's an interesting term because it's something that is constantly changing. And I'd say that previously sustainability has been used or classed as corporate social responsibility, CSR, or primarily used as a marketing function in a business, but it's not been used as part of the core business. And this has created fundamental problems because organizations have not been embedding sustainability into how it operates and functions. And it was enough for companies to appear that they were doing something, and therefore customers have been misled. However, I'd say that things are changing. We are constantly being bombarded on a daily basis about our changing climate, flash flooding, wildfires. We literally hear about it every day. And it's increasingly clear that organizations need to be doing much more. However, greenwashing still exists, and sometimes in more covert ways, I'd say, at the moment. And a really good example of that is that the UK has set a net zero carbon target for 2050, which is legally binding. And while 45% of FTSE 100 companies have committed to achieving net zero by 2050 or sooner, only 16% of them have a plan on how they'll actually achieve it. So it's all well and good having a target out there, but what is the value of this target if you have no plan to achieve it? And I would say this is a form of greenwashing that we're currently experiencing right now.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. It's really interesting what you say there, because we are being bombarded with so much terminology, and the use of that terminology and the credibility of the actual actions behind it is sometimes lacking, even from big corporations, as you say. You mentioned net zero, and this is a term that's really increasingly used. Could you explain to us, a little bit about, what is meant by net zero?
Yes, definitely. And I fully agree with you, because all of these kind of terminologies and jargon are being thrown at us with no clear definitions, or at least universally agreed definitions. And net zero is one of them. Unfortunately, we don't have an agreed definition out there, but whilst working at the Planet Mark, we are kind of setting our own definition as kind of best practice as possible, in line with as many standards and industry kind of frameworks as possible. So I'd say our definition of net zero is looking at your scope 1, scope 2 and 3 emissions. What I mean by that is your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are, for example, your electricity, your gas, any fuel in your fleet, for example, in your business operationally. And then your scope 3 emissions are pretty much everything else. So from your business travel to your water, your waste, procurement, but also your purchased goods and services. So your supply chain comes into this. And with net zero, best practice is to measure all of the scope 3 scopes, and looking at reducing your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions down to absolute zero. So that's looking at procuring renewable energy, having electric vehicles, for example, and then getting your scope 3 emissions down to as close to zero as possible. We do know that getting it down to absolute zero is pretty much impossible, hence the term net zero. And therefore, any residual emissions that you can't get down to absolute zero, you can then offset using carbon removal offsets.
Yeah, thanks, Lara. That's really great. And You mentioned the scope 1, 2, and 3, and a huge challenge for the industry is the scope 3, because by definition, we are a little bit of a dirty industry. Basically mobility, there's a lot of travel, a lot of transportation, etc., driving people around in cars to find homes historically. One of the things is with terminology, so we've got net zero, and thank you for that, but what about carbon neutral? Could you share a little bit on that?
Yes, and we get asked about this all the time. I'm speaking to organisations on a daily basis, hoping to achieve carbon neutrality as soon as possible. And luckily there is a framework that we can follow. It's kind of an internationally agreed framework called PAS 2060. Essentially, using those scopes that I mentioned earlier, to become carbon neutral, you have to be measuring only your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, have a plan to offset them and actually reduce them, and you can offset using carbon offsets. So it's a lot simpler than net zero. You do have to have a plan to reduce, but it's not kind of looking into your scope 3 emissions, which is why carbon neutral is great short term, but the best practice and what we're going towards is hoping and needing to achieve net zero emissions.
Thank you so much, Lara, because some people I've actually spoken to think that some of this terminology like net zero and carbon zero are actually intertwined and they're a lot closer, but you've clearly shared that there is actually a huge difference out there between the two and how meaningful net zero is. And I'm not saying that that carbon neutral isn't, but for the industry, our big challenge is really that scope 3. So everybody should really be looking at net zero. But you're right, you have to start somewhere. So do start with carbon neutral if that's where people need to start.
Yeah.
And one of the areas of mobility, I know you know about our industry, you work with people in the industry, and you've got a good insight into our industry. I mean, are there any sort of final thoughts and any takeaways that you would leave us with as people go on their sustainability journeys?
Absolutely. I think there's kind of 4 key tips that I would say to kind of help organizations and individuals on their sustainability journey. The first one of which is just to actually start and start measuring your impacts and your carbon footprint. You really need to understand your baseline in order to understand where you're at, where you can start to improve, and this will form the basis of your plan to continue to progress and therefore reduce your carbon footprint as well. And just making a start on this is so crucial. The second one I'd say is to start engaging and upskilling your employees to really help embed a culture of sustainability within your organization. Everything from helping to form green teams and really empowering your team to do more, get involved. And this will have a domino effect as they take that home with them. So it's such a great way to start engaging your team and kind of helping mobilize them to help them with your own targets. And then the third one, which I think is really relevant to this industry, is to start working with your supply chain to do more and get them to make a start as well. Just voicing your values and importance of these issues with them will help them understand how to start their own journey, and you can bring them along with your own. And then finally, what I think is really important is to really communicate your commitments and achievements, but with authenticity and credibility. I think the most important part of all of this in relation to greenwashing is making sure that you are as transparent as possible. Transparency is key and it's very appreciated. And the main point here is that no one's perfect. We're all learning. Every single day, sustainability is changing, but just making a start and being open and honest about where you're at is most important.
Thank you very much for your words of wisdom there, Lara. And I completely concur with everything you've said there, and thank you for that. And the start small, and you don't need to measure everything, but start measuring something and make it meaningful.
Yeah.
So Lara, many thanks for joining us today. And again, thank you for your time. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.